You know what's wild? We walk around every single day saying things like rule of thumb and bite the bullet, without even stopping to think about where these phrases actually came from. And honestly, maybe that's for the best, because once you learn the origin stories behind some of our most common expressions, you're going to feel a little weird using them at your next family dinner. I mean, imagine casually dropping a phrase at brunch and then remembering it originated from someone getting their limbs chopped off in medieval Europe, or from a literal plague that killed half the population, because yeah, that's the kind of cheerful etymology we're dealing with here. The thing is, language is basically just a giant hand-me-down closet full of phrases that our ancestors passed down to us. Except nobody bothered to mention that some of these linguistic heirlooms are stained with blood disease and questionable decisions that would absolutely get you cancelled today. So buckle up, because we're about to ruin some perfectly innocent sayings for you, and by the end of this video, you're either going to be the most interesting person at parties or the most annoying one, depending on how much people enjoy having their everyday vocabulary deconstructed by historical trauma. Let's start with bite the bullet, which sounds like something a motivational speaker would yell at you before a big presentation, like, come on, just bite that bullet and ask for the raise. Except the original version of this phrase involved actual bullets and zero anesthesia, which is significantly less empowering when you think about it. Back in the days before modern medicine, when surgery was basically just someone with a saw and a prayer, soldiers who needed amputations or other horrific procedures would literally bite down on a bullet to keep from screaming or biting off their own tongue during the operation. Because apparently, the 19th century was just a never-ending nightmare where your entertainment options were either dying slowly from an infected wound or experiencing unimaginable pain while someone carved into you with tools they probably also used to fix wagon wheels. The bullet gave them something to focus on and prevented them from shattering their teeth while thrashing around in agony, which is somehow both practical and absolutely horrifying at the same time. And now we use this phrase to describe anything mildly unpleasant, like eating vegetables or sitting through a boring meeting, which feels like a bit of an understatement, considering the original context involved literal war surgery without drugs. Moving right along to saved by the bell, which you probably think came from boxing or maybe from that iconic 90s show about high school kids with problems that could be solved in 22 minutes. But the actual origin is so much darker that it makes Zach Morris's schemes look like wholesome family entertainment. This phrase allegedly comes from the Victorian era's absolute terror of being buried alive, which was apparently a legitimate concern people had because medical science wasn't exactly reliable at determining whether someone was actually dead or just really deeply asleep. So what did they do? They installed bells in graveyards connected to strings that ran down into coffins. So if you woke up 6 feet under, you could ring for help like the world's most depressing room service. And there would supposedly be someone on graveyard shift listening for these bells, which is possibly where that term comes from too. So congratulations. We just ruined 2 phrases for the price of 1. The idea was that if you weren't actually dead and you woke up in your coffin, you could yank that string and alert the night watchman that there'd been a terrible mistake and could someone please dig you up before you run out of air. And while historians debate whether this actually happened or if it's just an urban legend, the fact that people were so worried about premature burial that they invented coffin alarm systems tells you everything you need to know about how much trust they had in their doctors. Then there's give the cold shoulder, which sounds like something your ex does when you run into them at the grocery store, but it actually comes from medieval hospitality customs that were way more passive-aggressive than anything modern dating culture has managed to produce. When hosts wanted to politely tell guests it was time to leave without actually saying "get out," they would serve them cold shoulder of mutton instead of a hot meal because apparently in medieval times people communicated entirely through the temperature and quality of their meat, which honestly tracks when you consider that these were the same folks who thought trial by combat was a reasonable way to settle legal disputes. A cold shoulder of mutton was basically the medieval equivalent of your mom cleaning the kitchen really loudly when your friends are still over at midnight. Just a subtle hint that you've overstayed your welcome and it's time to hit the road, except instead of passive-aggressive dish clanging, you got a disappointing cut of room temperature sheep, and honestly both methods are equally effective at making people feel unwanted. These days we use it to describe someone being deliberately unfriendly or dismissive, which is pretty much the same concept, except now we do it with one-word text responses and leaving people on red instead of serving them subpar medieval cuisine. Let's talk about at loggerheads, which people use to describe being in conflict with someone. Like Karen and I are really at loggerheads about the new office coffee policy. Except the original loggerheads were not abstract metaphors but actual weapons. Because of course they were. Everything in history is either a weapon or a disease. A loggerhead was a long-handled tool with a solid sphere of iron on the end that sailors would heat up and use to melt tar for sealing ship seams. But when things got tense on the high seas, these same tools became extremely effective weapons for cracking skulls during maritime disputes, because nothing says professional disagreement like bludgeoning your coworker with heated metalworking equipment. So when sailors were at loggerheads, they were literally threatening each other with these implements, which is significantly more dramatic than sending a strongly worded email or leaving a passive-aggressive note in the break room. And it really puts modern workplace conflicts into perspective when you realize that our ancestors handled disagreements with actual violence instead of just stealing each other's labeled lunches from the communal fridge. Now we need to discuss deadline, which is possibly the most anxiety-inducing word in the English language if you've ever been a student freelancer or literally anyone who's ever had to complete a task by a specific date. But the original deadline wasn't about turning in your essay or submitting your taxes. It was an actual line that would get you actually dead if you crossed it. During the Civil War, prisoner of war camps had a physical line marked around the interior perimeter, usually about 20 feet from the fence. And if prisoners crossed this line, guards were authorized to shoot them without warning, because apparently a "please stay away from the fence" wasn't clear enough instruction, and they needed to add lethal consequences to really drive the point home. The Confederate camp at Andersonville was particularly notorious for this practice, where overcrowding, disease, and starvation were already killing prisoners at an alarming rate. So they figured, why not add a line that guarantees instant death if you're just trying to stretch your legs too close to the perimeter? Because nothing says humane treatment of prisoners like giving guards permission to use you for target practice if you accidentally wander a few feet in the wrong direction. So yeah, every time your boss sends you an email with deadline in the subject line, just remember it could be worse, because at least Janet from accounting is not literally going to shoot you if you submit that report late, although sometimes the tone of her email suggests she'd like to. Here's a fun one that'll make you think twice next time you use it. Rule of thumb, which people throw around constantly to mean a general guideline or principle, like the rule of thumb is to save 3 months of expenses for emergencies, which is solid financial advice, but also potentially references a horrifying piece of folklore about domestic violence. There's a persistent but disputed claim that this phrase comes from an old English law that supposedly allowed men to beat their wives with a stick as long as it was no thicker than their thumb, which would be absolutely horrific if true. And while most historians now say this is actually a myth, and the phrase probably comes from various old measurement practices where people used their thumbs as rough units of measurement for carpentry and other trades, the fact that the domestic violence origin story became so widespread and believable tells you something pretty dark about historical attitudes toward women. Either way, the phrase is tainted by association now, and you can't use it without someone at the table going, "Actually, did you know?" And then everyone feels uncomfortable while eating their pasta, which is why we can't have nice things or apparently innocent idioms that don't come with a side of historical trauma and questionable etymology. Let's get into caught red-handed, which sounds like something from a cop show when they find the suspect literally holding the evidence. And that's basically what it means, except the original red hands referred to being caught with blood on your hands immediately after killing someone, usually after poaching game from royal forests or murdering someone in medieval Scotland. If you were found standing over a body with blood literally on your hands, there wasn't much room for a defense attorney to work with. Not that medieval legal systems were particularly concerned with things like due process or reasonable doubt. Anyway, so being caught red-handed meant you were absolutely screwed and probably heading for execution, or at best some creative medieval punishment that would make modern prison sentences look like spa vacations. The phrase appears in Scottish legal texts from the 15th century, where it was used to describe being apprehended in the act of committing a crime with incontrovertible physical evidence, and now we use it to describe someone getting caught doing literally anything wrong, from stealing cookies to cheating on a test, which is quite the downgrade from the original usage that specifically involved murder and blood and immediate consequences that didn't involve just getting grounded or having to write an apology letter. Moving on to pulling out all the stops, which sounds like something a motivational coach would say before you attempt some ambitious project, like, "We're really pulling out all the stops for this product launch," as if you're about to deploy every resource and effort imaginable. But this phrase actually comes from pipe organs, which is possibly the least terrible origin story on this entire list, except wait, here's where it gets dark. The phrase refers to pulling out all the stop knobs on a pipe organ to allow all the pipes to sound at once, creating maximum volume and dramatic effect, which is fine and actually kind of beautiful. But organs have this deep association with Gothic horror, funerals, and Phantom of the Opera vibes that make even innocent organ phrases feel somewhat ominous. Plus, many of these massive church organs were playing during some of history's darkest moments. from funeral masses during plague years to the soundtrack of various religious conflicts and persecutions. So while the phrase itself isn't from a terrible event, organs have been the background music to enough historical trauma that they carry that association. And now you're going to think about that every time you hear someone talk about pulling out all the stops for the quarterly sales meeting, which is probably not the emotional context they were going for. Then we have break the ice, which everyone uses to describe starting a conversation or making people comfortable in an awkward social situation, like let me break the ice with a fun icebreaker question, which usually makes everything more awkward, but at least nobody dies. Unlike in the original usage where breaking ice was a literal life or death situation. This phrase likely comes from the dangerous work of ice-breaking ships that had to forge paths through frozen waters for other vessels to follow, which was incredibly hazardous work where one wrong move could sink your ship, trap you in freezing water, or crush you between shifting ice sheets because apparently even simple maritime navigation was a horror show before modern technology. There's also a theory it comes from the practice of breaking ice to reach water during winter, which was crucial for survival in cold climates, but also dangerous because ice can collapse and drown you faster than you can say awkward small talk. And honestly, given the choice between breaking actual ice in medieval winter conditions and breaking conversational ice at a corporate networking event, I might take my chances with the networking event, even if it means discussing synergy and key performance indicators with strangers. We need to talk about turn a blind eye, which people use when they're deliberately ignoring something problematic. Like when you pretend not to notice your roommate hasn't done dishes in 3 weeks because you don't want to start another argument about the chore wheel. But this phrase comes from Admiral Horatio Nelson, who legitimately had only one functioning eye after being wounded in battle, and he used his disability to his advantage during the Battle of Copenhagen. When his superior officer sent a signal to retreat, Nelson reportedly put his telescope to his blind eye and claimed he couldn't see the signal, then continued fighting and won the battle, which is either brilliant tactical insubordination or an absolutely wild disability accommodation depending on how you look at it. The thing is, this seemingly clever story is actually from a battle where hundreds of people died in naval combat, with ships exploding and sailors drowning and all the usual horrors of 18th century warfare. So using this phrase casually to describe ignoring your co-worker's terrible cologne or pretending not to see your kid sneaking cookies before dinner feels a bit trivial compared to the context of a guy with one eye making command decisions that would determine whether hundreds of men lived or died. But here we are, using it to describe avoiding minor inconveniences and uncomfortable conversations. Let's discuss spitting image, which people use to describe someone who looks exactly like someone else, usually followed by of their father or of their mother. And everyone just accepts this weird phrase without questioning why we're talking about spitting in relation to physical resemblance, which is gross when you think about it. The actual origin is disputed, but one theory suggests it comes from spirit and image, which got linguistically corrupted over time until it became spit and image, and then spitting image. Which is how language evolution works. It just slowly mangles things until nothing makes sense anymore. Another darker theory connects it to various old beliefs about family resemblance and inheritance that involve some pretty questionable ideas about bloodlines and genetic inheritance that were used to justify everything from monarchy to slavery, because historical people loved taking innocent observations about family resemblance and turning them into elaborate justifications for social hierarchies and human rights violations. There's also an old superstitious practice where people would spit to ward off evil or bad luck, and some theorize the phrase connects to ideas about children carrying the essence or spirit of their parents, which sounds vaguely wholesome until you remember that historical superstitions were usually tied to fears about changelings, evil spirits, and demonic possession, because our ancestors were convinced that any child who acted differently might be a fairy replacement or possessed by demons, which is way darker than just saying, wow, your kid looks just like you. Now for Read the Riot Act, which people use when they're about to seriously scold someone, like my mom really read me the Riot Act about coming home late. Except the original Riot Act was an actual law passed in England in 1714 that authorized local authorities to declare any group of 12 or more people an unlawful assembly, and officials would literally read this act aloud to crowds, giving them 1 hour to disperse or face arrest, imprisonment, or even death. The full title was An Act for Preventing Tumults and Riotous Assemblies and for the More Speedy and Effectual Punishing the Rioters, which is quite a mouthful and also pretty explicitly about state control of public gatherings, because nothing says free society like making it illegal for people to assemble and giving authorities permission to arrest or kill them if they do not leave within 60 minutes of being told to. This act was used to suppress everything from labor protests to political gatherings. Basically, anytime working class people got together to complain about being oppressed, authorities could show up, read this act, and then legally crack down on them with violence if they didn't immediately disperse. So using this phrase lightly to describe your parents being mad about your curfew or your boss being upset about dress code violations is like comparing a paper cut to a battlefield amputation in terms of severity and historical context. Here's one that'll make your skin crawl. Sleep tight, don't let the bedbugs bite, which is what people say to children at bedtime. Like it's a cute little rhyme, except it's literally warning kids about parasitic insects that will feed on their blood while they sleep, and the historical context makes it even worse. The sleep tight part supposedly refers to the ropes that supported mattresses in old bed frames, which needed to be tightened regularly to keep the mattress from sagging, because apparently people in the past just accepted that their beds would slowly become hammocks if not maintained. And the bedbug part was just a genuine concern because bedbugs were absolutely everywhere before modern pest control and sanitation. These little nightmares would infest beds, feed on sleeping people, cause itching and infections, and there wasn't really anything you could do about it except maybe boil your bedding and hope for the best. Which rarely worked because bedbugs are surprisingly resilient little horrors that can survive for months without feeding. So this cute bedtime saying is actually just a casual reminder that you're about to be unconscious and vulnerable while tiny vampires crawl on you and drink your blood, which is possibly the worst possible thought to put in a child's head right before they're supposed to fall asleep. But sure, let's keep saying it because tradition. Finally, let's talk about knock on wood, which people do superstitiously after saying something hopeful or positive like, I haven't gotten sick all year. Knock on wood, followed by physically touching wooden furniture as if that's going to prevent cosmic karma from immediately proving you wrong. And honestly, the gesture is so automatic that most people do it without thinking about why they are basically petting their desk like it has magical protective properties. The origins are murky, but one theory connects it to ancient pagan beliefs that spirits lived in trees, so knocking on wood would either wake the spirits to grant protection or ward off evil spirits that might be listening when you tempted fate, because apparently evil spirits are always eavesdropping on casual conversations, waiting for someone to express confidence so they can immediately ruin everything. Going to prevent cosmic karma from immediately proving you wrong, and honestly, the gesture is so automatic that most people do it without thinking about why they're basically petting their desk like it has magical protective properties. The origins are murky, but one theory connects it to ancient pagan beliefs that spirits lived in trees, so knocking on wood would either wake the spirits to grant protection or ward off evil spirits that might be listening when you tempted fate, because apparently evil spirits are always eavesdropping on casual conversations, waiting for someone to express confidence so they can immediately ruin everything. Another theory ties it to Christian traditions about touching wooden crucifixes or relics for protection, which connects the practice to centuries of religious conflict, persecution, and the general human anxiety about divine punishment that characterize much of European history. There's also a children's game called Touchwood, where you're safe from being tagged if you're touching wood, which seems innocent until you realize that many traditional children's games are actually watered-down versions of much darker historical practices and superstitions. Like Ring Around the Rosie being about plague symptoms, so who knows what existential terror lurks behind this wooden touching tradition that we've turned into a casual superstitious gesture. So there you have it. Your everyday vocabulary has been thoroughly ruined. And you're welcome for that, because now you get to be the person at parties who drops these fun historical facts and watches everyone's faces go from amused to horrified as they realize the phrases they've been using their whole lives are connected to war, disease, violence, and humanity. His general enthusiasm for turning terrible experiences into catchy expressions that we still use centuries later without thinking about it. The weird thing is that language works this way because humans are phenomenally good at taking trauma and packaging it into memorable phrases that stick around long after everyone's forgotten why they're saying it in the first place, which is either a testament to our resilience or evidence that we're all just collectively repressing historical nightmares by turning them into figures of speech. Either way, next time someone tells you to bite the bullet or asks if you're at loggerheads with someone, you can smile knowingly and remember that our ancestors dealt with way worse than traffic jams and awkward work emails. Although honestly, they probably would have found our modern problems equally ridiculous if they could see us losing our minds over Wi-Fi speed and social media notifications. If you enjoyed having your innocent vocabulary destroyed by historical context, make sure to leave a comment with your favorite traumatic phrase origin or any expressions. I miss that you'd like me to ruin for everyone else. And don't forget to knock on wood that you don't accidentally use these phrases at inappropriate moments, now that you know what they really mean. Although at this point, pretty much every moment is inappropriate once you know the backstory. Tentar novamente,